My people, the United States has just stopped issuing visas to citizens of Burkina Faso after the West African nation refused to accept deportees. It doesn't get more serious than this. Now, we've been sounding the alarm for months about how immigration, aid, and foreign policy are quietly being weaponized against African nations. But now, the stakes couldn't be higher. Because what's happening here isn't just about travel restrictions or deportations. It's about power. Who gets to decide Africa's place in the world? And the question is, can one small African country under military rule, sanctioned by ECOWAS, stand up to Washington and change the course of how Africa negotiates its dignity on the global stage? Because if Burkina Faso holds the line as it is now, it could spark something bigger, a new wave of African countries saying, enough. Enough of the double standards, enough of being punished for choosing independence, enough of being treated like the world's dumping ground. So today we're breaking it all down. What really led to this standoff, how the US is using visas as leverage, and what Burkina Faso's defiance means for the rest of Africa. But before we break it down, please do me a favor and subscribe to our channel and tap the notification bell for alerts. And if you enjoyed this video, like, share, drop a comment, a super thanks, and join our membership community for more exclusives. All right, now let's break it down. So let's talk about what really went down. According to Burkina Faso's Foreign Minister, Karamoko Jean-Marie Traoré, the United States quietly reached out to Burkina Faso a few weeks ago with what they called a migration arrangement. The ask, the U.S. wanted Burkina Faso to accept a group of deportees being expelled from America, not just Burkinabe citizens, but also foreign nationals from other countries. Basically, we don't want them here, so you take them. And guess what Burkina Faso said? Absolutely not. Their foreign minister didn't even sugarcoat it. He called the U.S. request indecent, quote, and, quote, unworthy, and said Burkina Faso is not a land of deportation. He went on to say, and I quote, naturally, this proposal, which we deemed indecent at the time, is totally contrary to the value of dignity, which is part of the very essence of the vision of Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Now let's pause for a second. This is a small, landlocked African country standing up to one of the most powerful nations in the world and saying, we will not be used. And you already know, the U.S. didn't like that. So within days, the U.S. Embassy in Ouagadougou suspended all visa services. So if you're a Burkinabe citizen trying to travel, study, or visit family in America, you now have to go to Togo just to apply. No press conference, no official statement, just quiet retaliation. And the message was clear. You said no to us, so now you are going to feel the pressure. And this, my people, is what makes this story so significant. Because this isn't about paperwork or deportations. This is about power. Who has it? Who's losing it? And who finally has the courage to say no? Now let's zoom out, my people. Because what's happening here isn't just about Burkina Faso. It's part of a bigger pattern, a new kind of diplomacy that doesn't use armies or aid, but visas. The U.S. has quietly turned visa access into a tool of control. If a country cooperates with Washington, then the doors stay open. And if it doesn't, the doors slam shut. Visa suspensions, travel bans, targeted restrictions. They don't even have to call it punishment. The effect is the same. And this power play is part of something much larger and much darker too. That's quietly putting Africa right at the center of America's immigration wars. I'm talking about Trump's third country deportation plan. And here's how it works. Instead of sending deported migrants back to their own countries, the U.S. cuts secret deals with other nations, what they call safe third countries, and pays them to take in people who aren't even their citizens. So far, Rwanda, Eswatini, South Sudan, and Ghana have quietly signed on to receive deportees from the US, although Ghana claims that it did not receive compensation for it and that it did it in the name of Pan-African solidarity. Watch my episode on that. But most of these agreements are hidden behind terms like migration cooperation, which is rarely debated in public, never voted on by their parliaments, and barely covered in the media. And here's what's even worse. The US isn't just deporting its own nationals through these deals. It's sending other people, refugees and migrants from Latin America, the Caribbean, and Asia, straight to African soil. That's right. People who have never set foot on the continent are suddenly being relocated to Africa because of a deal signed behind closed doors. And all of it is dressed up with words like security, deterrence, and mutual cooperation. But let's call it what it is. This is outsourced deportation. It's the US shifting the moral and political burden of its immigration crisis onto Africa, treating the continent as a convenient dumping ground for problems that it doesn't want to solve at home. But here's the thing, my people. Let's talk about why this moment actually matters. Because what Burkina Faso just did, saying no to Washington, is bigger than visas. It's bigger than deportation, and definitely bigger than politics. This is about dignity. It's about a small African nation reminding the world and reminding us that sovereignty still means something. I mean, think about it. Most governments would have taken the deal quietly. They would have said, let's not upset the US. We'll find a way. Because that's how it's always been. Fear of losing aid, fear of visa bans, fear of being cut off. But Burkina Faso did the opposite. They called the deal indecent, unworthy, and a violation of dignity. And they stood firm, even knowing there'd be consequences. Now that's rare, because for decades, the power dynamic has been one way, one-sided. The US dictates, and Africa just adjusts. The West sets the rules, and Africa follows. But this time, an African country drew a line. And that's what makes this so powerful. Now, of course, critics will say it's easy for a military government to posture against the West. And yes, Burkina Faso has its own internal challenges. But symbolism matters. And moments like this can shift how African nations see themselves in relation to power. Because for too long, we've been told that our choices must align with donor priorities, strategic partnerships, or international expectations. In other words, your independence is only valid if it's convenient for someone else. But this decision, this simple no from Burkina Faso, pushes back on that entire system. It says Africa doesn't have to accept everything handed down in the name of cooperation. It doesn't have to absorb other people's problems to earn respect. And it sure doesn't have to sell its sovereignty to stay connected to the world. And here's what makes it even more poetic. While the US was shutting its doors to Burkinabe citizens, Burkina Faso opened its borders to all Africans. No visa, no restrictions, no barriers. Now, that's not just foreign policy. That's a statement. It says, if the world won't open up to us, well, it's about time that we open up to each other. That's Pan-Africanism in real time. Not a slogan, not a conference speech, but an act of political courage. And that's why Burkina Faso's defiance matters. Because it's not just about one country standing up. It's about the idea that Africa can finally stop asking for permission. So, my people, what happens now? Because make no mistake, this isn't the end of the story. When a small African country stands up to the United States, stands up to Trump, you best believe that there will be consequences, yes. And we've already seen some of them. The US visa suspension in Burkina Faso means that students can travel easily. Families are now being separated. Business trips canceled. And this is how power works in the modern world. You don't need sanctions or soldiers. You just shut the door, one at a time. But here's the thing. While the U.S. might win this short-term power play, it could lose something far bigger: its moral credibility on the continent. Not that they care anyway. But here's the thing. Every time Washington uses visas, aid, or military assistance as a weapon, it reinforces what many Africans already feel: that partnership with the West often comes with strings. And those strings always lead back to control. And that's where the danger lies, because Africa is changing. We're in a moment of realignment, politically, economically, even spiritually. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have already formed a new alliance of Sahel states, cutting ties with old colonial powers and forging new partnerships with countries like Russia and China. Now, you can question their methods, but one thing's clear: the balance of power is shifting. And the U.S., well, they're struggling to adapt. So here's what might come next. Washington could double down, tighten restrictions, threaten aid cuts, or quietly pressure neighboring countries to isolate Burkina Faso. But if it does, that strategy could backfire, because every heavy-handed move only fuels the same sentiment spreading across the continent that Africa doesn't need to beg anymore. It can trade elsewhere. It can partner differently. And most importantly, it can define its own red lines. What Burkina Faso did wasn't about anti-Americanism, right? It's about self-respect. It was about sending a message that partnership must be mutual, not manipulative. And that's the bigger story here, because if one small nation can say no, it creates space for others to question, to push back, and to negotiate better. It shifts the tone from what can we get to what will we accept. And that, my people, is where real sovereignty begins. So yes, Burkina Faso may very well face isolation and short-term pain. But in the long run, they may have just sparked something deeper. A reminder that dignity can't be negotiated, that independence isn't given, it's defended. And if that spirit spreads across the continent, then maybe, just maybe, this little standoff over visas won't be remembered as a punishment, but rather as a turning point. Because the day Africa starts saying no is the day that the world will start listening. But my people, this is about more than one country's defiance. This is about Africa's silence. The real question we should all be asking is, what would happen if Africa had a unified response? If instead of 5 or 6 countries cutting quiet deals on deportations, the entire continent stood as one and said, no, you will not dump your migrants here. These are our terms. Do you see how that completely flips the script? Because right now, Burkina Faso is doing the right thing, right? But it's speaking alone, fighting alone in a continent of 54 nations. And my people, that's the problem. Because as long as Africa negotiates in fragments, it will always lose in full. As long as we bargain separately, others will always play us against each other, offering aid to one, sanctions to another, praise to a few, and we fall for it every time. And my people, here's where it gets even deeper, because right now, Trump is after Africa's critical minerals, the cobalt, lithium, and rare earths that power America's batteries, its electric cars, its defense systems. He needs Africa more than he admits. So imagine if we stood together and said, you want our minerals? Fine. But you don't get to ban us. You don't get to deport us. And you sure don't get to dictate to us. Do you see that power shift? That's leverage. And that's the kind of collective confidence Africa has never truly used. Because the truth is, Africa doesn't have to be on defense anymore. We hold what the world needs: energy, minerals, people, markets, culture. But we keep negotiating like we're the ones asking for permission. So, my people, where do we go from here? You know, when we talk about power, most people think of armies, money, or influence. But sometimes power is simply the ability to say no and mean it. Burkina Faso said no. And even if they stand alone right now, that no echoes across the continent. Because what they're really rejecting isn't just a US policy. They're rejecting a mindset. The idea that Africa must always comply, always adjust, always wait for permission to defend its own dignity. And I know it's not easy. There's a price for standing up. Burkina Faso will surely feel the economic sting, the diplomatic pressure, the travel bans, the quiet isolation. That's how the system works. It punishes those who dare to think independently. But my people, here's the truth. If 54 nations stood together, that system wouldn't work anymore, would it? If Africa spoke with one voice, everything could change. Burkina Faso might be fighting alone today, but what if it's the spark? What if this moment becomes the beginning of something bigger, a shift of sort, from dependency to self-definition, from silence to strategy, from reaction to resistance? Because this is not about one country or one policy. It's truly about how Africa sees itself in this moment, what kind of future we're willing to demand. So as we watch this unfold, I want you to remember this. Power doesn't start when others recognize it. Power starts when you realize you already have it. And maybe, just maybe, this is the moment. That's it for today's show. Thanks so much for watching. And if you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, drop a comment to let me know your thoughts, and share our channel with someone who needs to be a part of this conversation. And let me hear from you in the comments. Did Burkina Faso make the